Hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Melody Haas, and I will be one of the presenters today. I am also here with Chad Goff. He is the owner and founder of ForDiscovery, and we are a digital forensics firm based in Chicago. So today we're going to talk a little bit about internal investigations. We figured out that we work with a lot of clients that have internal matters and that they didn't necessarily understand how digital forensics could tie into their daily practice. And we recently did this as a CLE here in Chicago, and a lot of people asked for the webinar, so we're bringing it into a webinar today. I hope you enjoy it. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A, and we will try to answer them as we go through this. So today, we're basically going to start out with a brief overview of the State of the Union, and then we're kind of going to walk through the process and how digital forensics can help with from the beginning at strategy and consulting all the way down through the part of expert testimony if necessary. So we've basically had this slide in all of our presentations as long as I can remember. In 1992, Mitch Radcliffe was writing for MIT's Technology Review, and he said, "A computer lets you make more mistakes faster than any other invention in human history, with the possible exceptions of handguns and tequila." And that has never been more true in today's digital modern landscape, where people have devices on them all day and they're creating all sorts of data on cell phones, computers, servers. The moment that we do anything, it starts touching a whole bunch of different devices and creating a large digital footprint. So approximately half of the world's population is online. Right now, there are approximately 7.6 billion people on the planet, and there's 4.3 billion unique internet users out there. And all of these folks are using a wide array of places to store their data. What we have here in this picture is kind of a general idea of how some information could flow from a computer through other devices. So you can see up at the top, there's this computer, and maybe the person sends something through their email to their home computer because they want to work on it from home. Maybe they put it on a USB drive and they take it with them to their new workplace where they share it with somebody via email or put it up on that storage share. And so this data isn't necessarily just on one device. It moves through a variety of storage, and it's all based upon how users behave, the preferences for how they use machines, the different types of software platforms used during the course of business, and how different pieces of hardware and devices function. And so really trying to figure out during an investigation where we look, it takes a lot of cooperation between IT staff who are very familiar with the systems, legal teams, investigators, folks like us on the forensic side to figure out what we can get and where we can get it from. The basic stages of an investigation start with this concept of identification. Where is this data actually located? What data might be relevant? And then we go out and we collect it, then we analyze it, and then we have some type of reporting or findings that we ultimately end up discussing. And it goes through a wide array of investigations. We work pretty routinely on internal matters, a lot of incident response cases, somewhere in the employment trade secret realm where there may have been an employee who was doing something nefarious or they went to a competitor. And we have to try to figure out if they were in breach of any type of fiduciary duty, if they took some type of confidential information with them and are using it in some way that's not an appropriate use. Lots of things like FCPA compliance, going through all of those pay-for-play bribe schemes where people are sending text messages or things over WhatsApp about how they're doing business. We cover a very wide array of investigations.
So the first thing that we typically do when we get that phone call in for help is scope this case out. And scoping is the most important part of any investigation, and we spend a lot of time on this phase. Figuring out what you actually need. I like to ask 3 whys. So we'll typically get a call that will say, "Hey, we would like you to make an image of this iPhone." And I will say, "Why do you want an image of an iPhone?" And it will come back that there was some information that was needed regarding Facebook. And I'll say, okay, well, what specifically regarding Facebook do you need? And they'll be like, well, there were some posts made on Facebook from this phone, and they're defamatory in some way, and we need to capture these and preserve them. So getting that three whys, really gets us to the point where the phone is probably, in this scenario, not the best source of evidence, right? Getting this directly from Facebook is probably the better option. Even though the post was made using the phone, it's probably not the best source of information that we would need. So asking three whys gets us down to what clients are really looking for and helping them figure out where the best case scenario may be to pull that data. And then there's obviously constraints that come along with every case. The first one is going to be, the scope of this. Is the data that you need available or accessible, and how difficult is it to actually access and analyze? Not every source of electronic information stays around forever, especially when you deal with third parties. They will have log retention in place where you may only be able to get logs for 30 days or 90 days. And if what you're looking for is outside of that time frame, you just might not be able to get it. And it also might be hosted by a third party and not accessible. So something like internet service provider logs, where you'd have to actually directly go to a Comcast or an AT&T in that situation. And what kind of data it is and how difficult it's going to be to actually analyze. If it's legacy data that hasn't been used in a long time, there could be some constraints and some gotchas that were going to impact whether or not this is technically feasible. Second constraint is always time. When do you need these results? And is it technically feasible to get them to you in the amount of time that you have available to you? Some of this is outside of our control. It's third-party data that we might not have direct access to. We may have to make a request to get that. And obviously, if it's something where you need something in 24 hours, but the information stored online is just not accessible or can't be accessed in that amount of time, that may have an impact into the scope of your case. And then obviously cost. Once we have an idea of what we're looking to do, we can put a budget around that, and that budget may or may not impact the value of your case. So if you have a case that's only worth a few $1,000s that you're looking at, if the cost for forensics exceeds that or is a huge portion of your total budget for the matter, then it may be a showstopper right there. And then defining success, we always ask, what would the best case scenario look like? And we'll usually get something back like, we're really looking for evidence that this employee was soliciting any of these vendors to divert a contractor funds. So that helps us look for relevant information. It may be stored in email, it may be voicemail messages, it may be text messages, but having that best case scenario, think of the exhibit, the silver bullet that you'd like to put up in front of a judge or jury, that helps us define what we're looking for. And that sets the stage and helps determine expectations for the work as well.
So often when a case comes in, somebody calls us and they'll say, hey, we have a situation, we're looking at this employee, we suspect them of some bad behavior. And usually a lot of information is missing. There's usually not even a full background put together yet. We're being brought in pretty early. People haven't had time to investigate all the facts. A lot of times we don't even know what it's really about. And so we like to spend some time doing a structured kickoff call that actually helps us get a lot of the information. Often we'll actually get a laptop in our office for imaging before we even have a kickoff call so that the people internally can run around and grab some facts so that we can bring together the folks that have specific knowledge. So something like someone from HR who's handling this employee issue, someone from IT who is knowledgeable about the different systems that people use, folks that have specific roles like ourselves. And then those who have decision-making authority, you know, whether it's the legal team or some type of executive that's sort of leading this investigation, somebody who has that ability to say yes or no to whatever plan it is going forward. And it really helps ensure that all the different people working on this matter are all on the same page and have the same expectations about the work to be performed. And so ultimately, what we really want to get out of this meeting ultimately is, you know, a good start is what is already known, what's been done internally so far during this investigation, and what have you found that's going to help us understand our fact pattern. You know, most of the time, timeliness is really the main thing that we're looking for. When did this incident actually occur? And as Chad was talking about earlier, when it comes to collecting data, sometimes some of these facts actually impact the way that we collect data. So it's a very important part of the process. You know, looking at what type of data actually matters, going back to that scope, what are you really trying to prove or disprove? And when we start talking about what type of data sources should we collect and where might this data be stored, really it comes down to coming up with a scope that's not too narrow so that we're missing a whole bunch of evidence because it's not stored in one particular location. And it's not too broad that we're not collecting an entire server with terabytes of data and trying to look through that when really all we're looking for is a specific folder or a set of files. And so just remember that these things can be stored in a lot of locations, which is really going to impact how we collect the data. And it's really difficult to conduct investigations if you don't understand where data is stored and how people use these systems in their day-to-day operations. So we like to say that companies should do an information governance assessment to understand where all their systems are. It actually really helps with litigation holds, producing data, but that's not necessarily the case. A lot of our clients have never done this before. And so one of the things that a forensics professional can actually bring to the table is helping you understand where your data is stored. So often we talk about this during the kickoff call to try to figure out the logistics of who has access, who can help us get administrative accounts for collection. And so this is a fundamental part of the process that kind of drives all that budget, scope, information that we were talking about earlier.
So the goal of this is obviously to have a well-defined scope, and this gets all of the relevant parties together. It helps us determine what the end game is, basically when do we stop this investigation, making sure that it's worth the time and money to the client, and making sure it's cost benefit feasible, and building a roadmap out so that as we work through the investigation and work through the analysis of all the electronically stored information, that we can provide timely updates, making sure that we hit deadlines, making sure that what's being looked at and what's being produced and all of the findings are going to line back up with your case, and you're going to get relevant findings and information, not a lot of things you won't be able to use. When doing an investigation, there's usually two things that we look at. Is the information incriminatory or exculpatory? So are you looking for something that happened or potentially something that didn't happen? It can be difficult to prove a negative, but we can say within a reasonable degree of certainty that a specific event did not happen, or there's no evidence that the specific event happened. As a sort of a mini case study, we've worked on cases before where there was an accident on a playground in a school district, and there was an allegation that the teacher was not on the playground monitoring the students, that they were inside using a computer. So this is a situation where they were looking for exculpatory evidence. It was basically that the computer was not in use during this point in time. And absence of evidence can be evidence of itself. So lots of other cases that we worked on where we've had emails that were sent during a period of time where there's zero activity on the actual computer itself, leading to us to say that there was some other device out there that was sending and receiving these emails for this custodian, and it wasn't being done on the device that we're actually looking at. So to sum it up, we'll get a fact pattern. We'll have some electronically stored information, whether that be computers or devices, cloud data, or logs. And we have a good idea of the scope and what you actually want to know. So the goal here is to get to the middle of that Venn diagram and get to the good stuff.
So before we start, we always like to say that there's a lot of things that impact the ability to do certain things during the course of an investigation. Largely, that's going to come from laws and regulations, especially here in the state of Illinois. There are some very specific pieces of legislation that govern how people can or cannot make inquiries, whether it's in certain industries or inside of the workplace. And so understanding those can actually help inform what you can and cannot do during the course of this investigation. And there's a ton of ways that, talk about how evidence can actually be authenticated in court. And so all of this needs to be taken into consideration as we're working through it. And the other part is going to be the agreements and policies that are put in place in the workplace. Usually there's some type of confidentiality agreement, employee handbook, the different types of acceptable use policies. All of these essentially make a rules of the road. What was the employee supposed to do, and what happened, where they went afoul of these policies. And so a lot of these versions, what did they sign? This comes into play later. We've had quite a few cases where there was not a very strong confidentiality agreement in place, but we were able to find other things that showed a breach of fiduciary duty, which is a very different type of claim. And so understanding what these policies are also helps you build that set of facts that you can use later in your case. And these really need to be updated regularly to keep up with technology. We've seen a lot of policies that seem like they were written a very long time ago, and a lot of the specific words and phrases that were in there don't speak to the newer forms of cloud-based technology or bring your own device or things of that nature.
So talking about forensic data and actually how to get access to the electronic information, there's just some basics. And regardless of what technology that you use, there's really 4 criteria that it needs to meet to sort of be called evidence. The first is that it has to create an exact copy or clone. So whatever's on that source media, wherever that collection is, we need to collect all of that data. So if there's 1,000 logs, we need to have 1,000 logs that we actually collect. And we use hash values, whether it be MD5 or sometimes SHA-1, on the source destination to make sure that what resided on the source is actually what we have for our destination media that we're going to work with and perform our investigation on. Whenever possible, you shouldn't modify the source media. So getting read-only access, where you're not going to be able to make any changes, or using hardware or software write blocking to prevent any changes to that device are best practice. The next one is residing on non-volatile media. That seems fairly straightforward, but you want to make sure that whatever evidence is collected is going to be somehow stored and secured in a way that's going to last for the duration of your case. And that could be years. Just making sure that anything that could be volatile, potentially change, does not do so during the case of the duration of your case. And obviously it must be independently verifiable. So if an opposing forensic expert needs to have access to any collected ESI, the processes and procedures that we use, the notes that we created, all should allow a third party to independently validate that the evidence was collected properly. So how do you collect? This is going to depend on the scope of the project. It's going to depend on the timelines for your matter, the budget. All of these will play a role into how information is collected. It can be done on site. So basically going to an office or a home or a client site and physically collecting information and making clones of it there. It can be done remotely. And this is fairly popular now. We do a lot of remote collections where we'll ship basically a collection kit to somebody in a remote part of the US or the world and be able to actually clone or capture information remotely and save on travel costs. And the information can be sort of brought into the lab. That allows for a lot of collections to be performed simultaneously. How you collect the data is going to depend on factors such as the size, how much data we're looking at. Is it physically located in a client site, in the cloud, in some server co-location room? The age, how volatile that data is, how quickly it rolls over, encryption, ownership, and alternate sources all depend on the collection. Typically, the most common thing that's collected is a hard drive, and that can be a laptop, a desktop, a USB hard drive, some sort of thumb drive. The most common method used is basically create a bit-by-bit or forensic image of that. It's a clone. It's a one-to-one clone. There's software and hardware that can be used to do this, and there's typically what's referred to in the industry as like an encase image or a forensic image. And we use write blockers to make sure we don't make any changes to that data while we collect it. A lot of data is stored in the cloud. This can be hosted email, Google, Gmail, Office 365, social media accounts, website captures, cloud storage like Box and Dropbox. All this information resides in the cloud. And they're usually collected through something called an API or a programming interface. It's worth looking at the fact that the APIs may not provide access to all the available data. Things like Google Documents have version history. Dropbox has version history that may not be exposed through the API. So, if you need every version of a document that ever existed, collecting it directly through the API may not give you what you're looking for. That may need to be done manually. So again, scoping this out and having a good idea of what you're looking for helps determine how we're going to go about collecting this data. Worth noting that providers can throttle large downloads. We recently had somebody that had like 90 gigs of email in a Gmail account. And after a while, Google only let you download a certain amount of messages or data per day. So this can make the collection time slow. Some providers also have the ability to do a direct export of your data. Google has something called Takeout, and Facebook allows for a download of your account and your profile data as well. Sometimes these are the best places to get a lot of this information. The Facebook downloads, for example, will list all of your posts and your friends and even deleted posts and information, and when you friended somebody, and when you unfriended somebody, when you changed your relationship status. All of that would be in a Facebook download that actually is a lot better than what you would get just by collecting from Facebook through an API. Mobile data. Mobile is probably the fastest changing landscape out there right now. So it is a giant, it depends. The type of device you have, whether it be iOS or Android, the model of the phone, operating system versions, and even down to the versions of the applications that you have on your phone can play a factor in whether or not this data can be accessed and extracted in a readable manner. There is some data that is unique to mobile devices, such as text messages, as SMS and MMS, where they're only stored on a device. So you can no longer go to a Verizon or an AT&T, for example, and subpoena them for text messages. They just don't store them. So if you need text messages, the only place that they will reside is on the phone that sent them and the phone that received them. And I've got this triangle or pyramid of essentially difficulty for extracting data from a phone. In some scenarios, a manual extraction, which would be just taking pictures of a phone's screen, might be the only way to get the information. And it might get the snapshot or exhibit that you need. It may be enough for your needs. A logical extraction would be something similar to like an iTunes backup. An iTunes backup does contain a lot of information. And if what you're looking for, again, based on scope, is in an iTunes backup, then that may be a sufficient way to do that. Physical extractions are sort of like a forensic image. It's a bit-by-bit clone of a phone. Not always possible to do on some phones, but whenever possible, that will allow us to get deleted information and recover a lot of data that you might not get through a typical backup. And JTAG and chip off are sort of two advanced methods to get information from mobile devices that may have been damaged in some way, dropped in water, been in an accident, damaged, cracked. JTAG and chip off are ways where we can extract data directly from the phone's memory chip and bypass a lot of the other information on the phone. Some tips on volatile data. Just turning a computer on and logging into it will make thousands of changes to a computer. We often get well, I just turned it on and wanted to look at some data in the email, or I just needed access to a document. That changes a lot of information. So whenever possible, don't turn a computer on at all. Don't log in, keep it off the network, and minimize any changes that may occur. Up front, you'll need to determine if the volatile data like last access dates and other frequently updated metadata fields need to be retained. There's no such thing as a previous last access date. So many times in the past, we would have an IT person or a manager that accesses somebody's computer and copies off a bunch of documents. When they do that, they're accessing the documents and they're modifying that last access date. So later on, they come back to us and say, well, when were these documents on the desktop accessed? Our answer is going to be 5 days after they returned their laptop, and it was done by the manager, and there's no way for us to tell what the dates used to be. Computers also have a lot of temporary files. They change data all the time. So web history doesn't stay around forever. Temporary files will get deleted after a period of time. When a file is deleted, it's obviously recoverable, but not forever. It does run the risk of being overwritten. So use of that computer may overwrite data that's relevant to your case. Some data access gotchas. Data has a way of disappearing or changing. We often see a custodial interview where they say, what data do you have in your computer related to this matter or this case? And where is it stored? They'll explain that I've got some documents in a folder, in my documents folder, I've got some email. And you're like, okay, great. Well, we're going to be collecting this. Please don't touch it or make any changes. As soon as you tell somebody not to touch something, the first thing they're going to do is go back to their computer, log on, and poke through that. So collect before you do the interviews. If possible, it can help prevent some claims of spoliation or changes to data. Also make sure that the data sources that you're looking at are owned by the proper people and not different parties. So a service provider can be the custodian of the data. And we run into scenarios a lot, for example, where it's an employer or a company issued device like an iPhone, but the iCloud account that they're signed into is under a personal account or like a Gmail address, for example. So it's a situation where even though it's a corporate device, the iCloud data that resides on there is owned by the custodian or the user, and you kind of have a mix of employer and employee-owned data that can cause some issues. Encryption, passwords are sometimes required to access data, and two-factor authentication is becoming more popular, and that's where in addition to having a user ID and password to log on to something, it will also send you sort of a one-time code. Those can limit our ability to collect data. Normally, we would just need access to that device to get that two-factor authentication code so that we can log on. On the forensic analysis side, so defining some terms. Computer forensics is the specialized technique for the collection, recovery, authentication, and analysis of electronic data. I like to say that computer forensics is the who, what, why, where, and how of a file. E-discovery focuses on the relevance. So forensics can tell you when a document was created, who authored it, how it arrived on that computer, if it was accessed or opened, were any modifications made, was it transferred anywhere. But if that document is your barbecue recipes, it's probably not very relevant to your case. So e-discovery focuses on that relevance. And the forensics in computer forensics is the methodology that's used so that the electronic information can be presented in as evidence in court. So when we start the analysis, it all goes back to the scope. Computers have millions of artifacts on them. Between all of the different files that exist on the computer, the documents, the applications, the operating system, entries in all the logs that exist on a computer, there can be millions of different artifacts. Having that scope will help us go through and determine what artifacts are relevant, how we're going to look at the data, and how we're going to extract a lot of this for review. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack. So the more information that we can remove based off time or types of data or types of activity help narrow down the amount of data and artifacts that we have to look at. Less time is obviously less cost. One technique that's typically used is pivoting off certain events. So if you're doing an investigation, there's obviously some sort of event that happened that you want to investigate. Knowing when that event occurred or having an idea of what that may look like helps us pivot off of all of these millions of artifacts that can exist and find relevant time frames and activities of interest. So after hours logons, Wi-Fi connections to hotel hotspots, or even a competitor's Wi-Fi network. If a USB device is plugged in, we can find evidence of that USB device plugging in. We know when it was plugged in, and we would pivot off that and look an hour before and an hour after that USB device was plugged in to see what type of activity that user may have done prior to plugging in that USB device. Keyword searching, I'm sure everybody's familiar with this, but it helps filter a large data set down into a smaller subset using keywords. We can run email addresses, phone numbers, company names, files, and we always say and recommend that you just be descriptive when you're requesting a filter or a keyword search to be run, and sort of leave the search syntax to the experts. So looking for things like emails between Bob, Susan, or John that were sent after business hours in March that have a PowerPoint that reference a business plan. We can take that request and actually turn that into a search term or a set of search terms that would find exactly what you're looking for. Typically this is what a client is really looking for, but when we see search terms, it will say, Bob's email address, Susan's email address, John's email address, business plan is a search term. And we end up with a lot of documents and hits that just aren't going to be relevant. Hash-based searching, it's an algorithm that's typically MD5 that you run against the file's contents, and it produces this statistically unique fingerprint. And it helps us find files that are byte for byte identical. So if I have a Word document and I copy it to a thumb drive or I email it, I can make a hash of that Word document that gives me a fingerprint. And then I can look for all the other files that exist to see if I have a file with a matching hash value. If I do, then I've found that exact same file stored somewhere else. And there's two methods for using hash-based searching. It's looking for known or irrelevant files. Sometimes they call this denisting, but this is a collection of hash values for things that we know we don't care about. It's the operating system, it's programs, it's content that's not going to be relevant to your case. And the known or notable or relevant files can be all of your content. So for example, we can just create a hash list of all the files on a company server and then check dozens of computers all at one time for any files that have a matching hash value. And we know we have the same set of documents that reside on both locations. Block-based and fuzzy searching are, block-based searching is when you're looking for a piece of a file. So imagine if you had a Word document and you took that Word document and divided it up into little blocks. And you would look for the presence of any portion of that document that resided anywhere on a computer. It's really good to look for scenarios where I want to know if this file or even a portion of this file ever existed on a piece of media. And fuzzy searching is used to find documents that have been changed or modified in any way. So my little screenshot is an example. I had a document that was changed from Acme Corporation to Halo Corporation. And the highlights there are in red for the changes to that document. So fuzzy searching can say, I've got a document, I want to find something that's 60 or 70 or 80% similar to this on any other piece of media. And this is good for finding alterations to contracts, email threads that have similarity between them, so help you group a lot of that information together.
And so filtering is something that we do on a pretty regular basis. So going back to the types of things that Chad was talking about, especially with something like denisting, we can use things like the search terms, the different types of activity. So sometimes people are really only interested in communications. So it helps us narrow down an actual specific type of activity that's occurring. We can do it by file type. So people will say office type documents. So we know it's things like Word, Excel, PDFs. Date ranges are used pretty regularly to help us limit the scope of what we're doing. So, if let's say an employee resigned a month ago and you want to know if they were solicited by someone prior to leaving, we probably want to extend that back at a minimum of 3 months. And so we're really looking at like a 4-month window. So it helps us cut back on the amount of data that we have to review. But often by limiting a data set too much, you can find a really specific event that's really important in the matter. So it's good to think of it as like a set of guidelines, but not being so strict that we're not able to make certain lines of inquiry. So you want to make sure that nothing gets missed during a filtering process. Geolocation data is really fun and really scary. Phones, by definition, are mobile devices, and they love to store location data. And a lot of different applications actually require location-based data to function at its maximum capacity. So things like Uber or Lyft, hey, I'm in this certain spot, I need you to come pick me up, works the best when it's that way. Things like Waze, when you're driving around and you make a trip. Realistically, companies just want this data for marketing purposes. So they're trying to figure out where you go, what you're doing. And so all the different artifacts on your phone talk together with all this location data to phone some stuff back to the mothership. But realistically, what that ends up meaning is that there's a ton of different information on a phone that has some type of geolocation-based signature. So whether it's some type of application data that has picked up the information as it's working, or it's something like Wi-Fi access points or cell tower data, all of that can be stored on a phone. So this heat map that's on here is actually just a box of phones that we bought off of eBay. We dumped some data out, and you can see that it was primarily from the Midwest. So if this was a certain type of individual or certain type of organization, you would be able to see that they were operating primarily in and around this area. Deleted data, Chad has already kind of mentioned this a little bit. What actually happens when you delete a file and then empty that recycle bin, right? It's not actually overwritten yet. It's sitting there waiting in the free space to be overwritten. And so what do you find when you look for deleted data? It's really a giant, it depends. If the computer, this file was deleted 6 months ago and the computer's been in constant use and there's high volumes of data being written, deleted, modified, it starts decreasing the likelihood that that deleted data is still going to be present. Also, people may use something like some type of special wiping software to ensure that the information is actually overwritten. But even if all of that occurs, there can be directory entries, some type of pointer. So, when you're using Microsoft Office and there's your recent files, things like that that point to the existence of a file, or some type of other metadata out there that lets us know that it used to be on the computer. Mobile data is interesting because we tend to think of electronically stored information in terms of files. We think of our loose emails or our Word documents, but primarily on mobile devices, this information is stored in a database. And so it's stored in a different format. And so often the way that we extract it and analyze it is very much in a structured viewpoint. So a straight up database or some type of spreadsheet. And there are tons of different applications that are installed on phones. A lot of forensic software packages have built profiles for some of the really common ones. So something like Facebook Messenger, something that's going to be used routinely by investigators. But then there are other types of applications that are not necessarily built out. So, things like Evernote. There's a lot of different information stored in an Evernote database, but it's not a standard database that's parsed by the software. So often we actually have to build custom profiles, extract data manually, and it takes some time and effort. So when we talk about the scope and what we're actually looking for, that type of information is useful because we can help figure out if there's going to be a certain type of application that might have information that's relevant to this matter. So for instance, we had an accident investigation where Pandora was a really big issue because it was all about distracted driving. And right before the accident, there weren't text messages being sent or other items like that, but there was a person using Pandora and there were artifacts in there that was, hey, right before the accident, they skipped a song. So that type of information it can be really useful in your matter as well. So how do we review and produce ESI? There's a lot of different formats. With cell phones in particularly and things like internet evidence, there are some type of portable application that allows you to search and review it. So similar to using a review platform like you're used to with Relativity or something of that nature. Actually, on the right-hand side of the screen is just some of the different types of data that would be inside of a reader package for a cell phone. We can do things like take messages and chats, produce them in that conversation bubble view. Timelining, making spreadsheets, doing some type of load file. You can even take data and restore it to devices for trial presentations. The one thing that we like to caution people, though, when it comes to producing and reviewing data is to not just focus necessarily on single records, especially when it comes to communication, because you will remove a lot of context around the activity that was occurring. So it's really important to kind of think big, and do you need a day of a conversation or a week of a conversation or a year of a conversation rather than just that one specific chat message that has that one keyword that was responsive. Timelining is a really fun way to analyze data. So we came up with a sexual harassment-based timeline. And so often when people say, I want to see text messages specifically, usually the interpretation of a text message is an SMS or MMS type message. It does not include messaging applications like Kik. It also would definitely not apply to other applications used on the phone like Yelp or some type of internet-based search on a Safari or Chrome browser. So in this specific timeline, we have Bob and Susie, and Bob is pursuing Susie. And so, it starts out as SMS. Susie says, hey, want to get together and work on that proposal? Then Bob kicks his friend Jack and says, hey, Susie asked me to get together. I think I'm going to make my move. Then Bob hops back over to SMS, says, hey, I'm swamped. Let's do it over dinner. Then searches for that romantic restaurant on Yelp. Then switch back to Kik. while he's actually out there at dinner and says, hey, dinner's great, 5th glass of wine, gonna finish that proposal. Next morning, we have the oh no regret text message that says, so sorry about last night, hope we're okay, mad at me. Internet search for sexual harassment. And then, he slacks a friend to ask what's going on at work, think he might have went too far. So if you would have just asked for text messages in this instance, we would have seen Susie and Bob texting, and there would have not been that extra context in there about Bob's intentions. So realistically, why does this matter? As Chad was talking about earlier, forensic artifacts are things, like they're facts that we can give you. Millions of them are out there. And so realistically, how forensics works with the rest of the investigation is you can kind of think of us as the weird, geeky computer person in a procedural drama. So I like to use Criminal Minds because I've definitely been compared to Garcia a few times. And that's what my mom actually says I am. So what I like to say is we're the nerds who can actually crunch those very oddly specific requests. As Chad was talking about those emails in March that have the business development plan attached. And that's a fact that you can use to help with the rest of your investigation. So it just helps cut down on a lot of noise.
So digital also meets physical. Most of the time when we're working on an investigation, we're provided with electronic evidence because that's what we do. We go through a lot of electronic evidence to find artifacts and things that are relevant to your case. And oftentimes clients will say, well, because you're dealing with the electronic evidence, you've got the electronic evidence, they don't need to provide us with the other facts related to the matter. So there's often some physical or other facts related to the case that we don't have access to or aren't provided with. The more that we know about the matter with key dates, times, and facts, the more that we can do and the more information we can find that may potentially be relevant. As an example, we may find just an appointment in somebody's calendar that says check-in at 2 p.m. Don't necessarily know what that means, but somewhere on the physical end of this, the employer or the client has a bill, that references a hotel check-in and a hotel stay, and that provides, physically where they were, when they arrived, when they departed, all that reference information, and it lets us know about that trip. So, example of this was a sexual harassment case that we worked on, where there wasn't a lot of electronic evidence, but there was some overlapping calendar entries for the two individuals that were involved in the sexual harassment matter. But the paper records actually put them both at the same MGM hotel in Las Vegas during that weekend, which definitely changed the dynamic of the sexual harassment allegations.
So the key here is really collaboration. The more that we know, the more that we can help you. Internal parties really have all of that institutional knowledge. They understand how the systems work, how people use them, and all of the facts that aren't necessarily going to be present on a computer. And so any type of routine status update or some type of phone call where people can get together and chat really helps us understand any newly learned facts that you've had, and it helps us all stay on the same page, because sometimes you found an aha that matches back up with some of the data that we've seen on a computer, and we might not have known that was relevant until we get that second piece of information that says, hey, we found something new and interesting. And so when it happens, we can really bring a lot of additional benefits. So running additional queries, now with that newly found information, potentially identifying new sources of information. So if you come to us with a fact pattern of a type of activity or system, we can help you understand where that data is, where it might be located, and if it's potentially relevant and something that we can collect during the course of this investigation. And then also we can help with creating protocols and protective measures for data collection. So earlier we were talking about third parties that may own information or devices. And so often what happens in an internal investigation is we hit that point where we've investigated the computer, the stuff's stored on the server, and now we're down to that BYOD phone that may or may not have messages that are relevant in this matter. And often people start throwing a fit when you start to ask about access to devices. And so we can help craft those protocols with all that language about who gets to see the data, how it gets produced, and things of that nature. And realistically, it's all about just narrowing things down. Investigations are full rinse and repeat. Something was missing, something gets found. Do we still have everything yet? And so throughout the process, we're taking a large amount of collected data and processing and reviewing it down to get down to a much smaller amount of information that ultimately gives us the facts that we need.
And last, if you're going to use an investigator, the goal is that their findings should in some way be able to be presented in court as evidence. So just make sure that you talk to an expert, get their qualifications, make sure that they can competently testify about their findings and results. Sometimes it's required under Rule 26 if you need it. And experts can also help on the meet and confer side when you start your case as well. So troubleshooting any potential issues you may have with the electronic data that you're requesting or that may be relevant, helping craft the discovery requests in a manner that's going to get you the information you're looking for, but not a lot of extraneous information. And well-crafted discovery requests are far more likely to be approved by the courts than something that's typically referred to as a fishing expedition. So a lot of this information can help at the beginning of the case, and it'll help with the scope of the case, and it also helps maintain and minimize your costs. Obviously, anything that you collect or want to use at trial or in court, having an expert will help you maintain that chain of custody and establish the evidentiary chain of all that data. And electronic information is usually factual and very, very hard to dispute. It's not there by accident. The scenario of, that text message on the phone that was sent to somebody else, that wasn't me. I didn't send that. That typically doesn't fly very well. So being able to present this evidence makes it a lot harder to dispute on the other end. Affidavits and expert reports really help to support motions and negotiations for settlement. So just having an expert report saying, I've got an expert and this is what they've found, can definitely help with negotiations for settlements. And they can be used to authenticate the evidence or author any opinions, including 30b-6 depositions, where it's often not really a good idea to take internal IT staff and put them on the stand that are 30b-6. They typically know where the bodies are buried. So experts can help out a lot in that scenario as well. We've reached the end. Thank you, everybody, for your time. If anybody has any questions, feel free to post them in the chat or Q&A section. If there are any questions, if you want to follow up with an email at a later time, feel free to do so to either myself or Melody. And I think we will be taking a recording of this presentation and making it available on our website as well. So, if you missed this or you had a colleague that missed this or something else you wanted to look at or go back and review, give us a couple days, and I think it'll be online where it can be viewed. And I think we plan on doing these on a fairly routine basis, so stay tuned for other topics as well. If you have an idea for a topic, feel free to reach out.